Start streaming.
Oh.
Okay, are we back? All right, we should be back now, I think. If not, they might be on it might be a new link, but we should be live streaming.
Let's see. Okay, I found the stream. Is it the same link? New link. Old link is dead. I'll paste it in chat.
All right.
Okay, so I think we're live now?
I think so.
Okay, cool. I will update.
All right, and all right, I think we are kind of back. Hey, we got some people in. All right, cool. Yeah, it looks like we're up and running. Everything looks good. Sorry for the stream section. I don't know what happened there, guys. Apologies about that. All right.
Well,
so,
according to chat, it was either hacked by Intel or hacked by AMD.
yeah, it was either hacked. Yeah, I think Lisa Sue is running a DDoS right now. She's probably
Right.
got Loic going
Yeah.
at her house from Sunnyvale somewhere. All right. Well, let's take it from the top. I'm gonna end up privatizing the other one. So
Yeah.
All right. So we're gonna take this from the top, guys. So. For anyone that is here watching afterwards, Steve and I are here today to discuss the launch of AMD Ryzen. There's been a lot of controversy behind everything with the launch so far. A lot of people have been talking about results with benchmarks, GPU bottlenecks, and stuff like that. So we were just hoping to kind of put some of those concerns to rest and hopefully stop the spread of misinformation, you could call it. So do you want to go ahead and start, Steve?
Sure. So I guess the thing we were talking about was differences in reviewers and the review results. And again, I said it a second ago, but we wrote an 11,000 word article. The Word document is something like 30 pages long. So in that article, I addressed most of this ahead of time because I knew it would be a big question, because we've been working with AMD for about a week. We had maybe 5 days to review the CPU like most people. We're working with AMD, Asus, Corsair, cooling manufacturers, and a couple of other folks. Most of the reviewers that you are familiar with, Paul and Kyle and Legit Reviews, I've spoken to everyone in the past week. And we knew there were some differences, but overall agreed on the results. So a lot of those differences are because of EFI version. So if you have an older version of EFI, it can make a pretty big difference because the microcode for Ryzen was not finalized until pretty recently, and it was about 3 weeks ago. So people who tested on the previous version of the Asus EFI, which we didn't, we were on 5704, which is the newest. The previous version is what AMD shipped with the reviewer kits. I went to Asus directly and said, is there a new one? That version was built on an old version, an old rev of the microcode. So you can see big differences. MSI, same thing. Gigabyte, you can also see differences with the EFI version. So I think that's the very basics of it.
Yeah, and for me, I was using the Gigabyte motherboard, and I was on the latest BIOS. I had checked the website when I first got the board to see if there was something newer. This was the third iteration of the BIOS for the AM4 motherboard, so that's what I was running in all of my testing. And I had heard like other people had issues with with their testing, crashing, RAM not being able to hit as high a frequency. I think someone said, I didn't watch Linus's review, but someone said his XMP didn't work. I mean, I don't know. I guess I was fortunate. I was able to slap in the Corsair RAM. I set the XMP, and it just went to 3,000 megahertz, and it stayed there. It was completely stable. Once I got my overclock dialed in on the CPU and everything, I've had no crashes. Both Ryzen CPUs have been rock solid.
Yeah, definitely the board impacts a lot, and the memory. Our second page of the article talks about memory for a while. Officially, AMD suggested 2600 or 2666 megahertz for benchmarking. We also received recommendations to benchmark at the highest frequency we could hit, which was 2933. But the memory frequency for, like you said, Linus, for other folks testing, it depends on two things. One is which die does your memory kit have? Hynix and Samsung have different results in terms of how far they can be pushed. And two, how much are you going to do in BIOS to get to a higher frequency? Because you can start adjusting the reference clock, and you can adjust, you can do memory training, step through memory training. So you set 2400 megahertz, EFI change, reboot, memory training, 2600, 2900, and do that over and over. You can get higher clocks, but the problem is, one, it depends on board, it depends on the die of your memory kit, and it also depends on if you're willing to change the reference clock, which that suddenly changes pretty much everything. So that's a benchmarking concern.
Yeah, and what was on your? Were you able to hit your XMP profile out of the box or no?
No. So we used 2933 megahertz, and the memory kit is 3000 megahertz. I manually set the timings. You can't change the sub timings, unfortunately, so that does sort of change how stable it can be. But no, the short answer is no. we got close.
All right. I guess the other big question that a lot or accusation a lot of people have been bringing up is GPU bottlenecking,
Yeah.
and I don't. I mean, it seems like I think you were the only person in your review who had talked about that. So I can't help but think that all of the people talking about it are coming from your review, hearing that, and maybe
Right.
maybe they didn't get the right information when they heard that, because you had talked. I believe someone had quoted you, so I'm going off of what they quoted you.
Yeah.
You were talking about 4K performance, and AMD had asked you to test at 4K, right?
Yeah.
And which would certainly cause a GPU bottleneck. It would narrow down the frame rates would be a lot closer. Just before launch, you and I had talked about this, about testing with different resolutions and stuff, and there's really no reason to test above 1080p, and 1080p I think is the perfect resolution to test at.
Right.
But it almost seemed like people out there wanted us to go out and test at like 1366 by 768 on low settings
Yeah.
with a Titan XP. And
Right.
the thing people kept pointing to in my benchmarks, I'll let it run here again, is they kept saying, "Oh, the GPU's at 99% load. It's at 99% load. It's a GPU bottleneck." Well, yes, it's at 99% load because I'm running VSync off. You could run a Titan XP on Half-Life 2 with VSync off at 240 resolution. Guess what? It's going to run at 99%. It doesn't mean it's a GPU bottleneck. It's just not being limited in any way by the game engine or VSync that's stopping the frame rate. So it's going to run as fast as you'll let it, or as the driver in the game is optimized too.
Yeah, it depends a lot on the software. That's the other big thing today, is like the software matters. The software is not built in the way that people are expecting the numbers to look, then it's going to make a difference. Yeah, so GPU bottlenecking, the analog would be, if you let's say I get a Vega GPU or a 1080 Ti GPU to review today, and I benchmark that GPU against a GTX 1060 and an RX 480. Clearly, the Vega or the 1080 Ti will be better, but if we run those benchmarks at 720p, the analog to running a CPU benchmark at 4K would be that. You would see, okay, all GPUs are the same. They all perform the same frame rate. And that's because the CPU would be limiting you, because for every frame that the GPU is capable of generating, of course, the CPU also has to do some work. It's got to handle draw calls, among other things. So 1080p, I would agree, is the perfect resolution to benchmark, because one, a huge percentage of the market's still on it, so we don't have to drop down to 1366 or whatever. And two, you can still there can still be GPU limitations depending on your game settings. You see that to some extent with Battlefield 1. But we did do some 1440p tests as well, just to demonstrate what happens, which is that the numbers, of course, get a lot closer, but still, as GPUs iterate, which they do, and people tend to own their CPU for a long time, that bottleneck will begin to disappear. In a year or two, you buy a better GPU, you plug it in, suddenly you might start seeing those differences more clearly at the higher resolutions.
Yeah, I was the same. I threw 1440p testing into the 1700 video begrudgingly. I was like, there's no point in me wasting the time doing all of this, but I know if I don't, there are going to be people like, oh, I just want to, like, because I get it. People just want to know, they want to know what it's playing at the resolution they want to
Right.
play it at. So I
Yeah.
get that. I get that. I get where they're coming from. wanting to know what this CPU will run a certain game at what frame rate, because that's the game they want to play and that's the resolution they want to play it, and that's fine. But I think for just the case of a review, what you're really just trying to see is what is the fastest processor, and testing at higher resolutions is really a moot point.
Yeah, I mean it's certainly worth doing to demonstrate what we would mostly expect, which is that yes, you increase the load on the GPU, suddenly the CPUs look the same, and depending on the game and the load you create, you could if it's a four-threaded max game and it doesn't care too much about frequencies in excess of 4.5 gigahertz, which is most of them, you could plug in an i5 and a GTX whatever. If you create a GPU bottleneck, it will look the same as an 1800X, which I guess to be fair, they already look the same in our 1080p benchmarks for the most part. But just like I was saying with the GPUs, you take a 1060, a 480, and a 1080 Ti, and they'll all look the same at a CPU bottleneck. So that's just a methodological thing, and that's fine. And then the other review differences again come from things like EFI, DRAM timings, and die type on the DRAM, Hynix versus Samsung, things like that, and plenty of other settings within BIOS that may or may not have issues depending on which motherboard the reviewer used.
Yeah, so I guess before we move on to anything else, I guess just do you think testing a GTX 1080 at 1080p is a GPU bottleneck for testing CPUs?
Depends on the game, and it depends on how high you push your settings. But you'll probably hit a bottleneck at some point if it's a game that is intensive enough.
Well, I guess
But
what I mean
generally,
is,
no.
I guess what I mean is would you say it's a fair way to test?
Oh, a GTX 1080 at 1080p with a CPU?
Yeah,
Hell yeah.
exactly. So
Yeah.
yeah, that was really the big takeaway, and that's that was the big thing that we've been seeing in the comments, and I hope that the people that were talking a lot about that and that were misinformed see this and hopefully take it and learn something from it. I don't know if you guys are going to be doing a follow up on your.
Yeah,
on your
we're doing a follow up. Yeah, which for people who read the article, honestly, it's probably not worth watching because I'm going to be recapping pages 2 and 3 of the review. But I'm doing it because written articles clearly have sometimes a different audience and they don't always overlap from videos. So we're going to do a video recapping pages 2 and 3. I'm going to be showing some of the conversations I had with AMD directly so that we can put those out there and talking about a couple of other interesting points. But a lot of the basics we're covering here.
Yeah, so I don't know. Is anything else we would want to cover on Ryzen? I think GPU bottlenecking was really one of the big things people were talking about. Were you receiving any other comments on your guys' content about testing that maybe we might want to clear up for people?
I don't know. Most of the comments have been about either testing at 1080p or have been the usual like what you would expect for any major CPU or GPU review, which is people on one side, people who may have been looking forward to Ryzen a lot will generally do you're an Intel shill. Did Intel come talk to you before you did your review? Intel emailed you and said, call us before you did the review. That's one thing I've seen a lot of, which no, they didn't. Maybe, I don't know, maybe they talked to other reviewers. They did not talk to us. And then the other side, of course, is if people think that the AMD CPU does too well on something, they're going to be like, how much did the AMD pay you to generate your charts? The answer to both is $0. And we've been talking with AMD for a week I've got probably a 50 email on thread. I had an hour-long conversation with them last night when I was finalizing the article. And we talked about EFI, we talked about logistical issues, all kinds of stuff. Before that, I had a 30-minute call with them before the second San Francisco trip. So we put in a lot of effort into this review, talked to a lot of people to make sure we were seeing the same numbers. AMD confirmed to me directly in an email that they did see the same SMT results we did to some extent. They didn't give me hard numbers, which is what I asked for, but they did tell me to expect about a 10% change in some cases, extreme cases, with SMT off. So we're not the only ones seeing that. I believe Extreme Tech did also.
Yeah, there was an AMA earlier today with Lisa Su as well, and she had been asked about disabling SMT, and she said that they had expected potentially higher frequencies with SMT disabled. So I do think it's something worth
Yeah,
testing as people are interested in. It's definitely something worth looking at in the future and seeing if we can get better overclock. She also mentioned lower temperatures as well. So I definitely think it's an interesting topic of discussion for a video and something I
it
do
will.
want to test.
Right, and there's also resource contention concerns, which I was talking to ASUS about this, and they've been talking to AMD, of course, trying to get answers, just like I've been trying to get answers. So there may be some resource contention where either software side or CPU microcode side, there is a fight between the threads on the core and who gets what resource when. So that could be a limitation too. But yeah, logistical issues overall. I mean, like I said in the review, the microcode was finalized about 3 weeks prior to any of us receiving product. So that means the motherboard vendors have had extremely limited time. And so the BIOS is very Spartan for most of the motherboards. It's not really final. The EFI changes and updates can impact results about 20% at kind of the mid range for some motherboards. And we did use the latest EFI. But there have been a lot of logistical things going on where manufacturers have been trying to get everything in order and functional, and that certainly impacts results to some extent.
Yeah, it seems like the motherboards have been held back a little bit. I saw some people saying like, "Oh, I already got my Ryzen CPU, but I'm waiting on my motherboard. It's on back order." I still haven't received any other motherboard samples besides what came with my Ryzen processor, and I've been talking with Gigabyte and going back and forth with them. So I'm not really sure when we're going to have other third-party boards, to test.
Mm.
But the one I tested though from Gigabyte was rock solid, as just as it was with Z270. It's been very stable, XMP working great, good overclocking and all that. So I didn't have any complaints about this board. I was happy that I thought, like they said, an ODM motherboard in the email. I was just like, oh great, they're gonna send
Right.
me like a green PCB motherboard, and
Something
everyone's
that's
and launch day everyone's gonna be like, this is pointless. You're running some crappy motherboard with a stock
right.
heatsink, and I was just like, ugh.
Yeah, there's a comment here. I've seen a couple of these, so I guess I'll just read it out. Whose review is more reliable? This is kind of what we're talking about this whole time. There are review differences, and it's because of two things. One is, again, differences in product and finalized states of whatever that product is, and two
Testing
is
methodology.
differences in methodology, right?
Yeah, I mean, you might. Some people may have. I don't like. I don't know. I think you guys do mostly in-game testing, but I can't speak for
Yeah,
other reviewers if they just ran the in-game benchmarks, which some people do. Personally, I try to do a little bit of a mix of both, depending on the
yeah,
game. Mostly, I do in-game though. I'll usually load into something like GTA 5 because the benchmark in that I do not find to be accurate. I'll load into Sandy Shores. I'll do a drive from one end to the other, and then back, and then I get my average, minimum, and everything
right.
from Fraps through that, or Morillus Action or whatever. Morillus Action's actually I've been using more recently because it works very well with DX12, and that's pretty much it. So
Yeah, I mean, ultimately, this is kind of old discussion, but when you as a consumer are reading or watching reviews, you kind of have to look at is this re- what is this reviewer doing for game testing or production testing, if that's what you care about. What are they doing? We define it all on our methodology page. I'm sure Joker, most of yours I know is either on the screen live or you talk about it.
yep.
Yeah, so you have to look at that and then just make a decision from there based on your use cases, what best represents me, and based on those results, should I buy this thing? And then hopefully you look through a couple of different reviews and and kind of compile the data in your head.
Yeah, I've got some of your guys' benchmarks up here now. I could see that your 7700K. It appears at stock settings it was pretty close to the stock 1800X, and then when it was overclocked, it took a pretty decent lead in Watch Dogs 2. Um, but yeah, it's
Yeah,
as far as who's testing is more reliable. I mean, you just go with whoever you follow. That's why I try to show things side by side usually, so
right,
it just removes that questioning. It's like, okay, here's where I tested. I tested on Ultra, so just take this information and do what you want with it.
right.
It leaves very little to interpretation from there.
Yeah, I mean, again, it's just how did they test, and does their testing align with your needs? And ultimately, we said this about the blender benchmarks, where I kind of referenced AMD's blender benchmark settings and how In a real world case, we don't agree with their settings. That's fine. The people who set it up said to me in an email they didn't optimize Blender for CPU rendering. They just kind of ran it out of the box, or whatever the sort of pre-made scene was. And so even though we don't, at GamersNexus, where I hire and employ a professional 3D animator, we don't use those settings for our renders. We do more samples, 400 samples per pixel. We do smaller tile sizes because it increases the CPU performance. But because AMD still ran their tests the same, you're just looking at deltas, which is more or less what you need. And so it's the same thing with reviewers. If the reviewer is conducting their tests in the same way, as long as it falls within some basic parameters to make sure testing is fair between platforms, then if they're just looking at deltas, that's ultimately the most important thing. Now, ideally, you do so without introducing bottlenecks on other resources. But that's what we've been talking about this whole time. So
Yeah. All right. I think that's pretty much it, mostly on Ryzen. The one last thing I wanted to bring up again was the 1700. I believe we started to talk about it before the first stream crashed.
oh yeah.
Was is like, yeah, if you're able to get that up to 3.9 or 4 gigahertz, do you really see much reason anyone buying the other processors unless they just want a higher out of the box CPU? Because that's kind of how I view it right now, is almost like paying for an aftermarket GPU with a better overclock.
Yeah, so we're working on the 1700 review. I would say that based on very early data that's not finalized yet, for most gaming use cases, a $300 something 1700 probably makes more sense than an 1800X, just like a $300 something 7700 makes more sense than a 6900K. So yeah, the 1700 is definitely the interesting one to look forward to.
Yeah, I mean, I liked it. I mean, because it was the same as the 1800X and cheaper. That's like, I was like, okay, that's a good thing. But then also was the fact that it just ran cooler. It's got the lower TDP of 65 watts, so it's 30 less than the 1800X and the 1700X. And
Right.
as a result of that, it ran much cooler. My 1800X at idle ran just around 50 degrees Celsius when it was overclocked, and this one was like 29 degrees Celsius, so about 20 degrees cooler. And that stayed the same with overclocking too on air. It stayed under
Yeah,
60C, so it ran much
lower
cooler. Yeah.
lower power budget. So yeah, it makes sense. And temperatures, by the way, are very difficult to accurately measure with the current CPUs. So
Yes.
the
Yeah.
software used matters a lot.
That was another big thing people had actually brought up. I'm glad you mentioned that, because like MSI Afterburner with Reaver Tuner, which is the overlay I use in pretty much all of my side by side comparisons. That's not hooking in getting the temperatures right now. It doesn't even bother displaying. I believe we had talked before release. You were saying IDA 64 was not giving accurate results.
Yeah,
I was using the SIV tuner from Gigabyte that is bundled with the motherboard, and that was able to give me accurate CPU temperatures, and it also had the red debug LED on the motherboard, which would also display live temperatures.
yeah. Yeah. So before release, Ada it got an update, and I haven't looked too closely at it. But during reviewing, Ada was definitely not the same as the other temperature readouts. So we were seeing in the 50s on that, when ASUS might be showing in the 70s in AI Suite, and hardware monitor would generally be about the same with the Tempin Zero sensor as ASUS. The way ASUS takes their measurements, I'm not sure about Gigabyte, but it's probably similar. ASUS takes the TSI temperature bus from AMD. They take that data, they combine it with their own thermistor that is located on the motherboard, and then they use an algorithm to effectively create a real world human scale temperature. The way the temperatures come out of the CPU, out of the TSI temperature bus, the temperatures do not come out as the actual temperature. This is not new with Ryzen. We've been talking about this since FX. They don't. So if your CPU, let's say we take a thermistor and we stick it on top of the die in a world where the CPU can run in that scenario, you might see 75 Celsius or something like that under a really serious workload, prime numbers or something. But the CPU, its temperature reporting will look lower than that. And that's because they use an offset scale. We talked to Sam Nafziger about this. He's an AMD corporate fellow, and confirmed that that's still how they're doing it, just like with the FX days. So temperatures measuring them, it comes down to the thing that it always does, which is your software accurate to the real world? And for a lot of the software right now, the answer is no, because it's new and they haven't updated it or even had samples.
All right, that's yeah, fair enough. All right, I think we've pretty much exhausted Ryzen now at this point, almost. Just
Yeah, I don't know. Like anything else, I feel like I'm mostly gonna be
yeah,
repeating myself.
yeah. If I guess if anyone has any questions for us in the chat about either Ryzen testing or anything like that, you can go ahead and ask us in the chat if there's something, we didn't answer.
Right. Yeah. Please post questions. I've got a bit more time, so
Yeah.
uh,
While people are posting questions in chat, what do you think about 1080 Ti release? Were you at the press event out there?
yeah, we covered
Oh yeah,
the
that's right.
both
You actually
the
did a video.
we covered the Vega and the 1080 Ti events. They were on the same day. I had someone else. I had Patrick Lathan cover the Vega event. Um, yeah, I don't know. I don't have a lot of thoughts. I don't know that that 35% number will hold up,
Well,
but
did you notice that when Jensen went into that whole 35% thing, it started off by saying that it was 35% faster in Prey than 1080 last year. That's how it started off, and then that continued into it's just 35% faster. But that's where it started. And I've seen him do stuff like that before. So
right.
I'm
Yeah, I
think
don't think we even mentioned it. Actually, we didn't mention it in the review because it was one of those like, okay, well, I'll validate this myself. Thanks.
yeah. Yeah, of course it's 35% does sound a bit high. I mean, with Titan X Pascal versus 1080, how much faster is
Right.
that on average?
I mean, previously they said the whole nine whatever GPU it was, maybe the 1080 is faster than SLI 980s or something like that. 2 times faster, I think. I don't know. I'd have to go look at my article from a year ago. But the number was not exactly always accurate. So that's just marketing. That's how marketing goes. It's accurate for 1 or 2 tests, and that's enough.
Good question from Final Roman. He said, "What is the max voltage?" I had emailed AMD about this. I think it was 1.37. Was that it? They said the
Yeah, they
highest.
recommended that we stick as close as possible, I think, to 1.365.
Yeah,
Yeah.
that's what it was. Yeah, 1.365. They had also told me TJ Max on the 1800X was 75 degrees Celsius. I'm
Yep.
guessing that's the same across all Ryzen 7 CPUs.
That would be my assumption. Yeah, we were told the 1800X TJ Maxx is 75C.
Is it possible to get over 3.9 gigahertz? I believe I did see one of the written reviews had gotten over 4 gigahertz. Mine couldn't hit it stable. I was getting, but I'm hopeful that I might be able to get 4 or maybe even 4.1 when I get it underwater. My AM4 bracket for my Deep Cool Captain actually just arrived while we were doing the stream. I got a text saying it was out there. So I think I might be able to get a little higher because I got 74C on mine at 3.9 gigahertz, and then I think I could if I turn up the voltage and everything underwater, I might be able to get a little bit more.
Yeah, so 3.9 gigahertz is about where we landed at the AMD event in San Francisco last week. Their overclocking event, they basically said most of the CPUs you should expect 3.9. Very few of them, but some will get to 4.1 or higher, 4.0. Now, one thing to address here maybe, some comments were like, why did you guys only overclock to 3.9? Clearly, it can do 4.0 or 4.1 because of XFR. When it boosts to those frequencies, and this is the same to some extent with Intel CPUs, the boost or turbo frequency is usually on just a few cores or threads. So with AMD, it tends to be 2 cores, I think, is the max it can do. 2 cores, 4 threads is what they told me last night on the phone. We saw with Cinebench 1 thread and POV Ray 1 thread, you generally you pretty much always hit the 4.1 number with some dithering between 4.0 and 4.1. So the reason we don't OC to 4.1 is because we can't, because it crashes, as you'll see in AMD's event where their system shut down and they said it was a capture card issue right when they hit apply. So that's because all cores can't necessarily handle that frequency.
Some people I saw were asking about the Ryzen 5 CPUs. They were asking if we thought they'd be able to overclock better. Should they wait for Ryzen 5? I would say, yeah, definitely. If you're on the fence on a budget, I would definitely wait to see final performance numbers if you're just a gamer. But
Yeah.
if you want to leverage the multi-threading, then the answer is pretty simple: is just get one of the Ryzen 7 CPUs. And also someone else had mentioned in the chat, it just disappeared. He was talking about, how even though it is like 5 to 10% slower in game performance, he makes a good point. Is that with the multi-threading being as strong as it is, I think it's still a pretty wise purchase decision getting one of the 8-core CPUs, even if like, for gaming for the future. I mean, some of the DirectX 12 I tested, like in Sniper Elite 4, and I believe it was the Division. I saw it getting leveraged across all the threads. So I think in the future it could hold up better, over time better.
Yeah, I mean, we sort of did a hard recommendation against the 1800X for gaming. It's $500 and it's
Yeah,
worse in performance than cheaper CPUs. It could get better, just like always. The software developers will certainly be trying to update their code. Now, AMD makes a good point in some of their discussion with us, at least, where they were saying, it's been a decade of software developers building for Intel compilers, Intel programming. Even if you look at hyperthreading over the years, it's gone from an overhead, like we saw with SMT, to at least slight benefit. So it'll take time to accommodate a new architecture. Software really matters a lot. Now, unfortunately, games take a lot of time to make. So you're potentially looking at years before that's really a widespread consideration that's been implemented.
yeah. Um, let's see. Anything else in here?
Sure, there's plenty.
Did you
Disable
try?
cores and
Yeah,
OC better.
yeah,
Yeah, you can definitely do that.
yeah. They're saying you should be able to get a little bit more on the overclock if you disable the threads. So like I had said that earlier in the stream, in case you got here late, I think it's something worth looking at in a dedicated video, but it's not something I would think to include in a main review because it's not really relevant to what most people are looking for when they're trying to make a purchase decision on a processor because like most people are not going to go out and do that. The majority of people probably don't even overclock. So
Right.
think about how even fewer people would be likely to go and do something like disables SMT.
Right. This question we kind of discussed, so I'll briefly hit it. But do you think that we might see Ryzen catching up to Intel in gaming scenarios in the coming weeks with everything BIOS, etc., up to snuff? I would imagine that as BIOS is updated further, there probably will be performance improvements, at least a couple percent, if not more. Again, it depends on the motherboard and how mature their EFI was at the time of review. So yes, we'll probably be looking at it as Asus or Gigabyte, now that we have their board, sends us EFI updates. I would not expect the 1800X that is, to make up the sometimes 20 to 30+% gap between the i7s that we were mostly making those comparisons to. But yeah, you'll probably see a performance improvement, but I would be hesitant to be overly optimistic. This is not a GPU driver scenario. This is more or less an architectural difference and fundamental issues with how the games are built.
Yeah. And how much they leverage more cores, or if they're single threaded. That was another one. Was XFR. That was kind of a weird one when I first got to testing it, and I saw how it wasn't really being used ever,
Right.
like ever at all, apart from a few synthetic benchmarks. So it seemed I didn't like the fact that it shows on the box 4 gigahertz and then XFR. I think a lot of people are being misled by that because I saw a few comments where they were like, why is your 4 gigahertz processor only hitting 3.7? It's like, because it's not a 4 gigahertz processor. One of the cores is a 4 gigahertz core, but that's it.
Yeah, you just like with Intel Turbo, you can hit 4.0, 4.1 sometimes in thread limited tasks, but when all the threads are engaged, you're only going to hit 3.7 max out of the box settings.
Yeah, that's never going to show you really a benefit in a game unless it's a very unoptimized game and it only uses one core. That's the only time you're going to see it hit 4.1 gigahertz in a gaming scenario.
Yeah, and like maybe World of Warcraft or something I've heard, or CS:GO maybe, but yeah, it's that info by the way is straight from AMD when I talked to them again last night on the phone and also in emails previously. It's 4.0 and 4.1 only on limited amount of threads engaged, not all threads.
Would deleting the Ryzen 7 help the overclock? No, it wouldn't. It's soldered on. They're not using a TIM like Intel does. They're soldered on, so that wouldn't give you any benefit.
Yeah, Der Bauer popped the lid on that. I don't think we were considering it after seeing that though, and what he had to do to get it off there. I don't know that we're going to.
Yep.
It's like it's probably, I think it's indium solder, So if you do liquid metal on there, there might be a slight difference, but like it's not the same as Intel's terrible thermal paste they use
Oh,
between their KB Lake stuff.
oh, we already talked about this, but this is Leo DS is one of the people that was very adamant in the comments that I was incorrect. So he says, Steve, can you please explain to Joker that if a GPU is at 100% load, the benchmark doesn't show accurate CPU performance. So can you explain that to me or to him?
um, well, so again, it depends on the software used to monitor and on the game. So with a CPU, you minimize, you look at Task Manager when a game is fully loading the CPU, or like with Blender, you'll see 16 threads engaged, 100% load, and that means that clearly the CPU doesn't have any more headroom to work. GPU measurements are not always easy to work off of. So memory is a good example where you look at VRAM consumption, air quotes around that, in GPU-Z, that's not actually the engaged VRAM. That's basically the requested or allocated VRAM, but it doesn't mean that all of it's engaged. GPU load, I would have to look at the specific games to see if it says it's 100% load, but I mean, it's easy enough to test. You throw a game at 720p or whatever, and then create a bottleneck definitively on the CPU, and that should answer the question. But I would have to look at exactly the titles and the software.
Yeah, but I think the case that he was making, though, is the one that I was bringing up earlier, is that he saw a GPU at 99% load and he just lost his mind. I was like, well, yes, that's because VSync is off. That's what happens when VSync is off. I could put any
Yeah, the
any
GPUs.
graphics card in the world. I could put in that system and turn VSync off. It's going to hit 99%. That's what VSync off does.
Yeah, it's working as hard as it can to create as many frames as it can. It might get limited by the CPU at some point, but again, I'd have to look at that specifically. I mean, it's I don't know. It depends. I don't know what games you were looking at for that, but GPU's crunching pretty hard too. So at 1080p, which is what we're testing, we did some 1080p Ultra tests, like with Battlefield 1, and definitely at some point you're still going to run into a GPU limitation. But the reason we do that is because I like to retain at least some proximity to a real world use case where 1080p Ultra is a pretty reasonable thing to want to run. So yeah, there you can definitely push into a GPU bottleneck, but the point is to minimize it as much as possible. Which, looking at your testing, very briefly in the videos, it looks like you're pretty much around the same workloads as we are. I know we have some different games on our benches, but resolution's the big impactor there, and yours were mostly at 1080p, so
Yep.
GPU is not going to be too limiting.
Yep. Yeah, it's like I said, pretty much any GPU, any game, VSync off. That's what it's going to do. You can't stop that from happening unless you cap the frame rate or something. Unless you cap the frame rate, and then what's the point of that? Because then the CPU is not going to be working anymore either. And the reason I like to test at 1080p with VSync off is because that does test the CPU. It tests its ability to be able to deliver the most frames to the user as possible. Because for every frame that your GPU is rendering out, it needs the CPU to process that. So if your CPU
Right.
is not fast enough, that equates to your frames per second. That's what it does. So
There's this question. I'm confused. What's the deal? B350 supporting Crossfire, not SLI. Probably a licensing thing, but Nvidia's got different requirements. SLI, you generally want. Scott Watson is calling me from AMD. SLI, you generally want.
is he trying to stream bomb us?
Yeah, DDoS. You want 2x8. A Crossfire can go down to by 4, but I would say it's probably more or less licensing cost for those lower end boards.
Yep. All right. Well, I think that's about it. I think you got to get going. You can't stay too much
Yeah.
longer, and I'm going to be going out here pretty soon in a minute. This was kind of an unexpected stream. I wasn't expecting to do anything until tomorrow. But I hope you guys enjoyed the discussion on Ryzen and everything. I'll leave a link down below to GamersNexus review and their channel if you guys want to check that out, or if you want to make AMD great again, you can get one of my shirts. I already have that link down in the description. But yeah, thanks for joining me, Steve.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Having you, yeah. All right, guys. We'll catch you next time. All right. Ta-ra.
See ya.